During the Victorian era, which lasted from 1837 to 1901, prostitution and issues related to sexuality underwent changes and complexities. Despite the general influence of religious and conservative values on the culture and morality of the time, there were various social and political changes that affected views on prostitution. Urban growth and industrialization during the Victorian era transformed the social and economic landscape of England significantly. This had an impact on the living conditions of urban populations and influenced the roles of women in society. The Victorian era witnessed a dramatic surge in urban growth. Factories and industries rapidly expanded in major cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool. The need for labor in these industrial sectors led people from rural areas to migrate to cities in search of more stable employment. The population growth in urban areas outpaced the ability to construct adequate housing. As a result, many people were forced to live in cramped, unhealthy, and inadequate housing conditions. Crowded tenement houses and poor facilities created an environment that harmed the well-being and health of the population. While factory jobs provided income, the wages were often low, and the working conditions were harsh. These low wages pushed many workers, especially women, to seek alternative ways to earn money. The pronounced social disparities also made some individuals more vulnerable to falling into poverty. During that time, job options for women were extremely limited. Most available jobs for women were low-paying and of minimal social status, such as work in textile factories or domestic service. Such jobs often did not suffice to meet basic needs. There was no social protection system as we know it today. People who fell into poverty lacked access to financial assistance or social safety nets. This is why some women trapped in difficult economic circumstances turned to prostitution as a means of survival. In this context, prostitution often became one of the few choices available to women facing economic and social constraints. These factors played a role in driving some women into the prostitution industry as a way to support themselves and their families, despite its risks and stigma. During that time, prostitution often wasn't confined to brothels or specific places. Instead, prostitutes often appeared in public spaces within the community, such as busy streets or popular pubs. The presence of prostitutes in these places became commonplace and was witnessed by many. Victorian society was heavily influenced by strong moral norms. The practice of open prostitution in public places was seen as violating the moral values held by the majority of society. The presence of prostitutes on the streets and in public places sparked debates about moral integrity and propriety of behavior within society. The practice of open prostitution also raised public health concerns. The spread of sexually transmitted diseases, especially syphilis, became a serious issue at that time. Prostitutes engaged in open practices on the streets and in public places were seen as potential sources of disease transmission. Due to the moral and health concerns that arose, the government took measures to regulate prostitution practices. One example of regulation was the implementation of the Contagious Diseases Acts in the 1860s. These laws allowed authorities to periodically examine and inspect prostitutes to detect contagious diseases and prevent further spread. Despite government attempts to regulate prostitution, prostitutes still often faced oppression and social stigma. They were often labeled as fallen women and were shunned by the wider society. In the mid to late Victorian era, prostitution underwent a shift from open practices in public places like streets to enclosed prostitution in brothels or other specialized locations. This change was largely influenced by growing moral and legal pressures that began to regulate prostitution practices. Society increasingly emphasized moral values and demands for maintaining social order. The open presence of prostitutes on the streets and in public places was deemed disruptive to social order and moral propriety. Consequently, there was moral pressure to relocate prostitution practices into more controlled and enclosed environments. The Victorian era was also a time when literature and critical writings began to address issues related to prostitution. Authors like Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy created novels that depicted social conditions, including the social and moral impact of prostitution. Literature during this era often reflected criticism of injustice and exploitation within the prostitution industry. These literary works depicted the stories of women trapped in cycles of poverty and violence, helping to raise awareness about these social issues. Prostitution during the Victorian era was strongly intertwined with social class inequality. Prostitutes often came from lower social strata, while their clients often came from higher classes. Most women involved in prostitution came from poor or economically vulnerable families. Some of them might have turned to prostitution due to the lack of other economic opportunities. The connection between prostitution and social class often triggered stigma and discrimination against prostitutes. They were viewed with disdain by the higher society and were often treated disrespectfully. In the discussion of prostitution during the Victorian era, we can see how this phenomenon took shape and developed within the context of social, economic, and cultural changes of that time. The Victorian era was a period of complexity and change, where prostitution reflected the dynamics existing in society. It's important to remember that prostitution during the Victorian era also mirrored broader social dynamics, including gender inequality, urbanization, and shifts in social norms. By understanding this historical context, we can gain deeper insights into the social, moral, and economic impacts of prostitution practices during that era.